She was found at the bottom of the landing and she did not remember how she got there.
Hollywood just threw open a familiar door, and something colder than nostalgia will step through it. With The Conjuring, last rites arriving in theaters and roaring out of the gate, audiences are flocking to see a so-called final case for Ed and Lorraine Warren. Please like and subscribe. Now, let's get back to the horror. The film's polish glints off a much rougher story that took shape inside a plain duplex in Pennsylvania, one that left a family exhausted, a neighborhood on edge, and a nation arguing about what we consider proof. Last Rites draws on the Smurl haunting, and the early turnout proves the public's appetite for this legend is still ferocious. Long before cameras and headlines, the river rose. In June of 1972, Tropical Storm Agnes swelled the Susquehanna and drowned the Wyoming Valley. Blocks of West Pittston disappeared beneath brown water, and families learned how fast a home can become a memory. In the months that followed, the town rebuilt in fits and starts, sorting what could be saved from what had to be forgotten. For Jack and Janet Smurl, rebuilding meant finding a place where 4 daughters could grow up near their grandparents and where faith could anchor the hard days. In August of 1973, they found it, a narrow 2-story double block at 330 Chase Street in West Pittston. Jack's parents, John and Mary, took one side. Jack, Janet, and the girls took the other. The arrangement sounded perfect: privacy, proximity, and the comfort of family within arm's reach. Catholic icons went up quickly. Fresh paint followed. Chores divided, school schedules settled, and the little rituals that make a life began to fill each room. It was an ordinary address, with ordinary dreams attached to it. The first disturbances were the kind that make people roll their eyes at ghost stories. Stains bled back through freshly coated walls. Tools vanished from a bench and reappeared in places nobody remembered putting them. Appliances sparked despite being safely unplugged. A sour, spoiled odor crept through the house and then dissolved when anyone tried to track it down. Old houses misbehave. Flooded towns inherit fussy wiring and warped boards. So the family did what families do. They made excuses and pressed forward. Then the house started to talk. Voices called out in tones too familiar to ignore. Janet would hear Mary summon her and walk into an empty room. Mary would swear she heard Jack and Janet arguing while the young couple sat quietly next door. At night, pressure gathered on beds like an extra body settling in. Hands that could not be seen brushed along shoulders and tugged at clothing. Whispers unfurled across pillowcases. Once a line like that is crossed, houses move fast. Shadows began to travel with purpose. Jack woke to a woman's whisper, turned to speak to Janet, and saw a flat shape race across her legs and vanish. Their German shepherd, Simon, yelped after an unseen lift and a brutal throw. One daughter stumbled halfway down the basement stairs after a shove nobody delivered. The hallways collected inhuman noises that sat too low in the throat to belong to anyone they loved. Sometimes the sound was a single scream that seemed to bounce off drywall. Sometimes it was a low animal rasp that made the air itself feel heavier. The house had moved from nuisance to predator, and the people inside it felt hunted. Years passed, and their private defenses thinned. By January of 1986, after prayers, counsel, and sheer endurance failed to restore peace, the Smurls called investigators who had already stepped into more haunted living rooms than most clergy, Ed and Lorraine Warren. On that first night, the temperature reportedly plunged. A black mass gathered where nothing should have had weight. Mirrors quivered. Objects slid and hopped, as if a hand you could not see were testing its reach. Lorraine spoke of multiple presences layered through the rooms. A troubled elderly woman, a restless young girl, a man who had died there, and behind them, something cold, clever, and domineering, orchestrating the performances. Ed tried the language he believed had authority: prayer, holy water, the invocation of Christ. Whatever listened did not leave. The Warrens knew how to fight, and they also knew how to draw attention. Within months, the quiet block on Chase Street filled with tripods and parked vans. Reporters knocked on the store, and then on their neighbors' doors. That August, the story broke wide in national media. Jack spoke to Larry King. Lorraine sat under studio lights and described the noises, the smells, the shadow that seemed to think. On the lawn outside the duplex, microphones bristled, and a press conference turned a small-town haunting into a civic event. Not every visitor came with sympathy. Paul Kurtz, then chairman of CSI Cop, went on record calling the whole thing a hoax, a charade, a ghost story, and he doubted the Warrens' objectivity as investigators. The front yard became a courtroom without a judge. Clergy arrived next, some local, some from out of state. Rooms were blessed. Doors and thresholds were marked and prayed over. According to later accounts, a priest from Connecticut returned for 3 separate attempts at exorcism. Each time, The house responded with noises that mocked the ritual. The family believed the presence kept slipping from one half of the double block to the other, the way a trespasser might step through an adjoining doorway to dodge a search. After each rite, the quiet never held for long, or the center of gravity shifted from saving a home to surviving a story. A Scranton reporter, Robert Curran, teamed with the family and the Warrens to put their testimony into a book, The Haunted, One Family's Nightmare. It read like a first-person chronicle of bruises, levitations, whispered threats, and long stamina. Reviewers were brutal, accusing Curran of choosing sides and abandoning skepticism. Then came the TV movie. On May 6, 1991, a primetime dramatization titled The Haunted aired nationally, with Sally Kirkland and Jeffrey DeMunn portraying Janet and Jack. For a few hours, millions of people watched a facsimile of the duplex digest a family from the inside out. It cemented the Smurl name in American paranormal lore and guaranteed that the debate would outlive the family's time on that street. In 1988, the Smurls sold their half of 330 Chase Street and left West Pittston for Wilkes Barre. The person who moved in after them reported a perfectly ordinary tenancy. For skeptics, that sounded like a verdict against the haunting. For believers, it sounded like evidence that the thing had attached to the family, rather than to the wood and plaster. Either way, the block exhaled, and the phone stopped ringing. There was another detail that skeptics raised like a flag. In 1983, Jack underwent a surgery to drain excess fluid after bouts of short-term memory loss linked to earlier meningitis. If the mind shapes reality, critics argued, then a mind under medical stress might shape it in spectacular ways. The family's response was simple. Jack was not the only witness. He was not the only victim. Neighbors, clergy, and visiting investigators had also heard, seen, or felt enough to keep them from snickering. It is possible to have a medical history and a supernatural problem at the same address. Time moved. The girls grew up and set down lives of their own. The duplex took paint the way old houses do and folded itself into the background of a quiet block. Jack died in 2017 at 75, remembered by those close to him for long service at work and at church, rather than for interviews on the lawn. One of his daughters stepped into paranormal investigation part-time, determined to be a voice for families who felt stranded in the dark. Janet left the spotlight and chose a quieter life. To drive down Chase Street today is to pass a place that looks innocuous and carries a very loud memory. The Conjuring. Last Rites does not pretend to give a stenographic record of what happened in West Pittston. Films in that universe are careful about their disclaimers, even as they are bold with their scares. But this release has pulled the Smurl case back into the public square, and the turnout suggests that the argument at its core still grips people by the throat. How much evidence does a haunting need before a community admits that something, whatever name you give it, has crossed a line? Opening week reports already show a franchise peaking again, and they name this case as inspiration. Here is where the story tightens. Even stripped of cinematic flourishes, the Smurl file contains ingredients that rarely combine outside of folklore. Voices that impersonate loved ones, shadows with intent, physical attacks that left bruises and fear, and a pattern of escalation that tracked closely with stress and exposure. It was domestic terror, not gothic spectacle. The threat clocked in at bedtime, followed the family into a vacation trailer, and allegedly mocked prayers offered in their own living room. Nothing about that scale of indignity fits an easy category. The architecture of the duplex matters more than it first appears. Two households under one roof meant an almost perfect machine for mishearing. A dropped lid on one side could become a crash on the other. A television turned low could become an argument in the wall. But counterfeit echoes do not explain everything. They do not account for a dog lifted and thrown, for a daughter shoved down steps, for the hard jolt of a falling light that split skin above a child's eye. They do not explain why multiple visitors, sympathetic and skeptical alike, reported the same smells, the same pressures, the same sudden temperature plunges. The Warrens remain the fulcrum of every discussion. To their supporters, the couple brought order to chaos and helped families face terrors that polite society prefers to laugh off. To their critics, they brought a ready-made narrative that they could drape over any troubled house. The Smurl case carries fingerprints from both sets of hands. There were tapes, photographs, and testimony arranged into a story arc that moved from discovery to siege to attempted expulsion. There were also cameras, contracts, and an inevitable march toward monetization that sits uneasily beside grief. In that tension, the Smurl haunting helps explain why the Warrens provoke equally strong devotion and distrust. Those late-stage exorcism attempts read like a chess problem. If a rite pressures one room, step through a shared wall into the next. If holy water settles on one side, slip away and wait. 3 tries and no declared victory left the priest as tired as the family. Even believers came to see the haunting as stubborn, mobile, and cunning in a way that human malice sometimes is. The lesson most people took was simple and bleak. Some invasions do not fear thresholds. The book and the film complicated everything by giving the haunting a spine. A narrative demands a climax, but real hauntings, if you believe in them, tend to decline rather than explode. The Smurls reported that persistent prayer seemed to quiet the rooms little by little until only knocks and fleeting shadows remained. That is not the sort of ending that lands with a studio logo, so the argument continued in papers and living rooms instead. People who needed a clean verdict did not get one. People who needed the world to be stranger than it looks felt validated. What should a reasonable person believe now that the case has been excavated again by a major studio? Believe that a flood knocked a family off its intended path and set them down in a building that would become a battleground. Believe that years of scattered incidents hardened into a single story that dared neighbors to pick a side. Believe that religious rituals, undertaken in good faith, sometimes fail to deliver the clean deliverance that movies promise. Believe that a later tenant slept through nights that once roared. And believe that all of those facts can be true at once without canceling each other. The Conjuring. Last Rites adds one more layer, and its success tells you something about why the Smurl case refuses to die. Stories like this sit at the crossroads of two human hungers. One hunger insists that the world is larger and stranger than our instruments can measure. The other insists that we must not be fooled. Between those hungers there is friction, and friction generates heat. That heat keeps the Smurl duplex glowing in the cultural memory decades after the last headline faded. Whatever you decide about demons, frauds, or faulty wiring, the family's ordeal has become a mirror. People do not just ask what happened on Chase Street. They ask what they would do if a house woke up angry and would not stop staring. Walk past 330 Chase Street today, and you will see an address that blends back into its block. No soot-black handprints on the windowsill, no figures etched in the glass, just a narrow home that carried a storm of its own, and then, eventually, went back to sleep. The world will watch a fictionalized version of those nights under theater lights, and then it will go home to quiet hallways. If your hallway ever feels too quiet to be trusted, you will remember this story. You will listen a little longer before you hit the switch. And somewhere in West Pittston, an old duplex will continue to keep its secrets, ordinary on the outside, contested in memory, and permanently enrolled in the uneasy school of American hauntings. Before anyone reached for holy water, the family tried ordinary solutions that feel almost quaint now. They replaced fuses and outlets. They cleaned ducts. They tracked the schedule of nearby trains to see if vibrations lined up with the worst of the noises. They logged incidents in a notebook, time, room, who was present, hoping that a pattern would betray a perfectly human cause. Patterns did appear, but not the friendly kind. Nights were worst. Weekdays were calmer, until pressure at work or a bill in the mail raised the temperature inside the house. Holidays amplified everything, as if the presents preferred to strike when the family most wanted to be together. Whatever stalked the duplex paid attention to their attention. That intelligence is the detail that still unsettles people. An electrical problem does not mimic a grandmother's voice. Settling joists do not write in residue across a bathroom mirror. Ed Warren would later claim that a message appeared telling him to get out, and that mirrors and furniture shook after prayer began. To some, that sounded like theater. To others, it sounded exactly like the escalation a malicious presence would attempt once confronted. The contention over those moments is why the Smurl case keeps being taught as a type specimen for what believers call infestation before oppression. First the house, then the people. Skeptical explanations are not lazy. They simply walk different roads. One path proposes poltergeist phenomena tied to the stress and energy of adolescence in the home. 4 daughters, a multi-generational household, a post-flood economy, and the relentless bills that chase working families. If you begin with psychology, you may never need the supernatural. Another path points at publicity. Once a story like this enters the media bloodstream, incentives change. You begin to talk in phrases the cameras understand. You begin to remember nights more vividly because the whole neighborhood wants a quote. And newspaper clippings have a way of tuning memory like a metronome. After months of attention, the human mind can harmonize with its own legend. Yet the ledger never balances cleanly. Neighbors described screams when the home was empty, and later residents described peace. A priest stayed over and reported nothing unusual. A technician stepped in later and felt the air cry cold in his lungs. 30 different people, the family would say, had experienced some facet of the phenomenon. If fabrication was the goal, it was a strangely democratic one, asking a whole block to participate. And if the mind could conjure that much menace from ordinary materials, then ordinary materials are not as tame as we pretend. The book that followed was inevitable, because all unresolved events rolled downhill toward narrative. Robert Curran gathered interviews, notes, and timing logs, and knitted them into a single thread. Critics pounced, and some of their blows landed. It is true that the book does not read like a forensic report. It reads like testimony, frightened, repetitive in the way fear is repetitive, and stubbornly insistent that what was heard and felt mattered even when meters did not budge. The television adaptation took those elements and translated them into images. The stains blooming back through paint, a bed hitting the floor with a shock, the sickly green of a hallway where the air refuses to move. Viewers who tuned in for entertainment received something stranger, a kind of visual affidavit that dared them to scoff. The Warrens themselves are a Rorschach blot decades after their first headline. Admiration and suspicion both have long receipts. They did sit with families in rooms no one else wanted to enter. They did push the church to act when local clergy were cautious. They also understood how a case becomes a platform, how a platform becomes a lecture tour, and how a lecture tour becomes a business. To watch their work on the Smurl case is to watch two currents collide: pastoral care and showmanship. It is possible that the haunting was real and the storytelling opportunistic. It is also possible that the storytelling was a lifeline that kept a desperate family going when official channels stalled. The Catholic lens matters too. It brings a vocabulary and a playbook that many households do not have. Saints invoked, sacramentals deployed, rituals repeated until the tongue numbs. It also brings expectations. If you live in a world where evil has hierarchy and strategies, then a string of insults scratched on a mirror lands like a telegram from an old enemy, not like a coincidence of steam. Belief can attune the senses, for better and worse. It can also sustain people through years that would flatten less stubborn hearts. Whatever else anyone says about the Smurls, their endurance was real, and their piety was not a costume. One detail that returns in interviews is how humiliation threaded through the fear. It is one thing to hear banging in the walls. It is another to feel as if the space where your family sleeps has been singled out and violated by something that understands cruelty. Descriptions of nighttime attacks are handled carefully in print because there are lines that public decency and platform policy will not cross. But the impact on the household is not delicate language. People who once loved bedtime began to dread it. Privacy became impossible. The family did not just feel threatened, they felt mocked. When the move finally came in 1988, it did not feel like a cinematic escape. It felt like the only adult decision left. There is practicality here that gets lost in the drama. If a space is sick, you do not argue with it forever. You leave. You try to reclaim birthdays and school programs and dinners that do not turn into vigils. The new tenants' quiet months did not erase the previous 12 years. They simply underlined how strangely personal the worst of it had been. Years later, obituaries and local retrospectives give the case the same respectful distance you hear in a townie's voice when he says, "I live 2 blocks from there." Jack is remembered as a husband, father, veteran, and steady hand at a local company more than as a name from a headline. Daughters married, worked, and in at least one case turned curiosity into part-time investigation so that callers who whisper, "I think something is wrong in my house," will not be laughed off the phone. The house itself keeps its own counsel, having outlived the rumor that it could not shelter anyone without incident. All of this is backdrop for why Last Rites has landed so forcefully. The franchise has always blended heart and dread, and this time it borrows the geometry of a real duplex, where fear wore work clothes. The opening weekend numbers say the appetite is still there, and the trade coverage is blunt about which case supplied much of the film's spine. If you walk into the theater without knowing the Smurls, you will walk out with questions that point directly at West Pittston. That is the risk and the gift of adaptation. It sends people back to sources, even when the film has happily invented half of what it shows. There is a small mercy in the way the story now sits. It no longer belongs entirely to believers, or to skeptics, or to a studio's calendar. It belongs to anyone who has ever felt a room watch them, and has had to decide whether to laugh, to pray, or to leave. Maybe that is why this case refuses to fade. It is not just about demons or debunking. It is about the decisions people make when the ordinary turns on them. It is about those first minutes after the lights go out, when you hear your name from the next room, and you already know that no one is there. That is a drama without credits. And for better or worse, it keeps writing itself. Stand on the sidewalk outside 330 Chase Street, and the asphalt hum from traffic sounds exactly like it does in every other town. Windows breathe, mail slots click, shadows shorten and lengthen and refuse to become anything more than shadows. The house looks as if nothing extraordinary has ever happened inside it. Perhaps that is the point. If the worst nights in a life can be swallowed by a building that looks like all the others, then any building can secretly hold a storm. That is the scariest part. Not the screams that made the papers, but the knowledge that you cannot tell, from a glance, what a home has endured. Down in the comments, let me know what house or place I should cover next. Please like and subscribe. Thank you.